welcome back. This is part 2 of 2 with Tony Vanderwilt. I got it right this time. If you're listening to this one but haven't listened to the first one, I would encourage you to go listen to the first one first. We are talking about creation and going to wrap it up with this podcast. It was so much meat, so much good stuff that we just couldn't get it all into one. So in saying that, welcome back.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talked about Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, so much going on, how there's this one story of really in the Bible, one story, all ties together. But we did not talk about creation in the 7-day sense. Right. So let's just pick up with that. Is creation actual literal 24 hours? How should we look at this?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, why are you asking the question? Not you, but why is the person asking the question? Most of the time, the reason that question comes up is there's a struggle with evolution, and there's a struggle with days, years. We got to get all this time compressed, and if we do that, then, if we don't do that, then we've got a problem. So for some, I've got to make 24 hours into 24 million years or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I've got to get that into that text. The others are saying no, which means we've got to have a young earth because it's only 24 hours and all of that. So what I guess what I'm saying is, like what we talked about in our last podcast, if Genesis 1:2 is one is saying, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. Genesis 1:2 says, it just enters us into the story, mm-hmm. Into this chaotic mess. Then you've got this next scene that starts saying God is filling the earth, and he is taking chaos and he is correcting it in a sense of getting it lined and detailed and set aside and all these things. And so how do I know if this is a literal 24 hours or it's not? Context has to determine meaning. Mm-hmm. And so my short answer to calm some folks down is yes, I believe it's 24-hour day, but I don't take that from Genesis 1:1.
Okay.
Why do I say that? Because in the first mention of day, you don't have sunrise, sunset, moon. You don't have that going on. Mm-hmm. The other reason is in I believe it's 2:4, I believe.
It's so helpful to have the Bible on your phone.
I know.
Isn't that so nice?
I'd be in trouble. I have to borrow one from you if I didn't have it there. So 2:4. These are the generations. And this is after he's gone through all the days and gone through Sabbath, morning, evening, day, and day, and all those kinds of things. It says these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
Yeah.
Well, is that day a 24-hour period? Context would say it's what?
It is.
Well, context would say that it's, so he says, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth mm-hmm. when they were created, in the day the Lord made them. So he's speaking there of the action of all of creation, which is 7 days. Mm-hmm. Basically, what he's saying there, in the day that they were created, he's talking about that time frame in which they were created, defined in context by those 7 days.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you let your context try and derive its meaning, he's not speaking there of, that those 7 days were one 24-hour day. Mm-hmm. No, he's saying in the day they were created, meaning in the time that they were created, those 7 days.
So you're saying that the word day can be used kind of interchangeably. Right. Yeah. And it's important to know the context.
That's right. See, what we want to do is we want to say, I want to take that word and I want to go back to the dictionary and want to know what it means. That doesn't work because you don't have any context. For example, when you first asked me to come on and I got your note through email or Facebook or whatever it was, I don't remember, it was Charlie. So I thought that I was going to sit down and visit with a guy. Now, you probably
Yep.
get that a lot.
I do.
Right? And I
Yep.
don't mean that to disparage you in any way.
No.
But point is then all of a sudden when I picked up the phone, what did I realize? Context determined meaning.
Yes.
Oh, wait.
I have a female voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your last name is?
Rose.
So Rose isn't a rose? You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
You can't take rose and say, well, this means a flower everywhere, always. No, sometimes it can also mean that it's the last name of a person. Yeah. Sometimes it can mean we're fixing to get up.
Yeah.
Or he got up.
They were. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
You see what I'm saying? Now, some are saying, well, you're trying to break down that it's not a literal 24-hour days. And I just say a couple of things. One is, I believe they're literal 24-hour days, or what we understand as 24-hour days, is because in Exodus, I believe it's 20 or 24, I should have brought it with me, but 20 or 24, when they're going through the Sabbath, in the context of when he's talking about the Sabbath and Israel observing the Sabbath, he is telling them a literal 24-hour day for what they understand and know. And he connects that to creation. So he says, for in 6 days, God created the world.
And they would have thought.
And they would have understood that not to mean 6 million years then it took to, no, they would understand that what he is saying to them is, in 6 days, God created the earth. On the 7th day, he rested. So he's using creation to share to them, this is what you do in this situation about Sabbath. But when he's connecting it to creation, he's helping us to understand that creation is what they understand as 6 days. Yeah. So you can't just take a word and extend it out. The other thing is so when he goes in later in Genesis, same book. And he goes in Genesis and he starts talking about Abraham, and he talks about Abraham when he went to, I believe it was looked out at Mount, I think it was Moriah. He said on the 3rd day he went out and looked at Mount Moriah. Oh, so 3,000 years later he went out and looked in Mount Moriah. No, the context tells you that it was 3 days after. 3 days after this, he did that.
Yes.
And so I have no problem with it being 24-hour day now. And think that it was. I mean, I genuinely think that's what God did, but I also think that God's a good communicator. So I think God is able to communicate in such a way that we can understand, and we just seek his wisdom and guidance in seeing that. Now, for those then who are really struggling in relation to, but then that means that all of science is wrong. I actually don't think that's the case. But it's sort of a non-issue for me, because when God created Adam, how old was he?
I understand the text to be a man.
Right.
Yeah.
Point being, he wasn't a baby, so he was created with age. Well, if God can create man with age, why can't he create the earth with age?
Yeah. And that is called like the day age theory.
Sure.
Would be.
Yeah. And so I can easily see putting lights, the stars in expanse that are already in motion. Now some can and use, and I don't think it's that it's not plausible. The flood in relation to that, causing age and all that, and I'm perfectly fine with all that. I don't. To me, it's so much of that's just sort of a non-issue. It's like whatever. The only thing I have asked, some said, what does it matter? Well, it does matter. Like for example, evolution, it does matter to me. It does matter, and for me, the reason that it matters is that I've not seen an evolutionary process when speaking about billions of years and all of that in terms of the age and death. I've not seen, this is me personally, I've not seen a model that showed the evolutionary process where you didn't have death before Adam.
Okay.
And so for me, that brings about a conflict. And now I know there are Christians who have have what I would say is workarounds in relation to that. But I know of who I believe are genuinely Christian who say, well, if you look at these other things different ways, then that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But for me, general reading of the text, it seems like to me that the death of man is a consequence of sin, and the curse on creation is a consequence. They are cursed because of man's sin. So for me, that would create a conflict that I probably couldn't. I at this point haven't been able to wrap my mind around in terms of being able to come to a resolution of it. But just remember that most of that is how you're approaching it, not what you're taking away from it. We don't claim that we know all that there is to know, but a scientist shouldn't either.
Yeah. And the Bible doesn't answer all. It answers the questions that we need to live a godly life. It doesn't tell me what to set the water on to boil an egg. It doesn't,
Sure.
So I love what you're saying with allow the context to understand the meaning.
Yeah.
The Bible is telling us what we need to know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to be able to enter into a conversation with someone who doesn't believe like me. And I want to be able to have the conversation with them without me. Yes, I believe that the Bible is inerrant and absolute authority of man, 100%, but they're not coming from that point.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be able to enter into a conversation with them where they're at. And so, there's probably, as it relates to Genesis, if there's those who are listening, I would probably just state that, I certainly don't claim to know all that there is, and I don't think that it's bad for us to study. In fact, I think in Genesis 2, you've got more science going on than what we ever imagined. In terms of, I think Genesis 2 is, if I was a scientist, I would know Genesis 2 because I think that Adam is our first scientist.
Yeah.
And so I am 100% pro science and study. But the only conversation I want to enter into that is that we're both making observations, and we're trying to glean from observations what is true. And neither one of us can say with full certainty on everything that this is true. So if we can enter into a conversation that says, is this reasonable? Is this a reasonable tenet for us to think about? Well, then maybe, hopefully, we can both have deeper conversations, and it opens the door for our minds to think more, and for them to think more, and for us to come to a common place.
Because that's ultimately the point, is to be talking to people who are unbelievers.
Well, what I want for people, I don't want for you or anybody else. I'm not looking for anybody to gain a greater head knowledge unless it changes to a better life and heart knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I see in 1, 2, and 3 that it answers so many questions for us that are a central tenet to living life. Two, if you don't understand 2, you don't understand what purpose do we have here.
Yeah. Why are we?
You don't understand power and sovereignty in relation to being able to live life to the fullest. So
information should lead to life transformation.
Well, yeah, because he's not giving us the information just for us to know, and that's what's going on with Adam and Eve. I don't hold that Adam, when he came into the world, knew everything there was to know about everything. That's the point. And so he's growing in knowledge and in hopefully wisdom. That doesn't mean that he's not perfect. He's perfect in the purpose for which he was created.
Yeah.
Well, that's us. Why is it that a podcast are blowing up right now? People desire to grow in knowledge and understanding. Where does that come from? And I'm saying it comes from the beginning. People want to have purpose. If I want to gather a crowd, I just tell everybody, come this Sunday. We'll talk about how you can know you got a purpose-filled life. Well, what is that? Everybody's that way. I'm holding that it's coming from the way in which we were created. It's the way that we were wired. Same issue with God's given us a certain amount of power. We've lost. We had incredible tragedy down South Texas with the school shooting.
Yeah.
And we don't have, for society as a whole, this is a broad brush, but with the society as a whole, we don't have a strong basis to be able to how to process that.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got 15 different agendas and particular things rather than how is it that we can process that? And it's an issue of power, which is an issue of sovereignty, which is an issue of how do we deal with power?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm holding that it's from the beginning, God talks about this. We've been given certain stewardship and responsibility for the ability to use the power that has been given to us for good purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And we're supposed to steward that. But we can also give it up.
Yeah.
And so it just it's just so full, and it's if 1 through 3 you don't really lock into it.
Yeah.
You don't really stop and think about it. You don't really wrestle with it. You're stumbling out of the blocks in life. You run a marathon, but right out of the blocks you're just stumbling and trying to catch up.
I love how you pointed out it's so applicable to life. Like Genesis chapter 1 through 3, it tells us God's sovereignty, about sin, about our purpose, all of that. And in saying that, it can answer a lot of cultural questions.
Yeah.
I love when we spoke on the phone, one thing you said is the church should be answering cultural questions.
Sure.
If the church isn't answering them, who is?
Yeah.
And that's the world. So in saying all of that, in Genesis, in creation, we see Adam and Eve being created.
Yeah.
We see that God made a man, and then out of his rib made a woman, and he said it was very good. But now there seems in culture to have so much confusion with maybe God was wrong in his design for certain people. Like maybe I feel like a man, but I have a woman's body. Can you kind of walk us through that process, and how are we at this place with so much gender confusion?
Yeah. So all that's going to probably come into how you're approaching probably as much Genesis 2 as anything.
Mm-hmm.
But 1 and 2 specifically. So if I'm approaching it simply in a scientific method,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm not holding to a personal God who created for personal reasons with purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So if another person doesn't approach it that way, we probably aren't going to agree on biological issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for us to understand that, because otherwise we're arguing a point that we don't agree with at the root.
Mm-hmm.
As far as that goes.
Yeah.
If you're approaching it and saying that God is the one who created, and he created for personal purposes, but for purposes for that creation as well, and that that's established at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
then we would see that he created them male and female, and he created them to be uniquely wired individually, but for them to come together as to be one.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1:1, but really in 1:2, and 1:2 is probably needs. I call 1:2 the either the stepchild or the middle child. So 1:2 never gets talked about, but 1:2 actually is the one that gives us purpose of man and power of man, and then it really shows what happened at the fall.
Mm-hmm.
But if God created them, what you see in the beginning is that he's created for purpose, and he's created them to have a certain level of responsibility. Some would call that power. And then he's created in terms of a redemption for his purposes. So we see all three of those things come in early on in relation to that. So then pre-fall, what we understand as fall, sin, we can talk about that now or later if we need to. But pre-fall, you've got the original before sin came into what's the ideal. I don't want to go back to halfway. If I want to go to the ideal, what do I want to go back to? And you have creation of a man and creation of woman, uniquely created, but but unity and plurality. So when he said, make them in our image, we talked about this, I think, last podcast, in our image, what's he talking about there? He doesn't develop it there, but it's a unity in plurality. Well, that's part of purpose as well. So now if me and my spouse, me and my wife, if there's not plurality, there's not a fullness to the identity of the image in which we were created. Because there's uniqueness in how we're made, uniqueness in roles, uniqueness in how we're wired, and all those things. So there's a plurality there, but when they come together, there's a unity. That's an image of God. So if you, I always like to ask the question, why would, we haven't got to Satan yet, but why would Satan attack certain things? Satan doesn't, I don't mean this badly, but I don't think he really gives a big rip about me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So any attack that comes to me is not really directed towards me as much as it's directed towards God. So why would Satan attack certain things? I've always thought about this. Why do you see homosexuality in the Old Testament as it's a sin? Yeah, and some people, sin's a whole nother conversation, but it's a sin, but it's seen as a sin where you have an escalation in society that turns away from the moral basis of God, and it's not, it doesn't simply hold to oneself. I'll do what I want to do, you do what you want to do. In Scripture, we see that there's an attack to get to move into your world. And so why is that?
I'm thinking right now of your original thought, which was the purpose and design of us. We were created by God, for God, and then when it becomes about us, that's where the attack is.
Yeah. So what I'm seeing is that it's we think about sin in terms of, well, you just need to live right. You just need to live. You need to have a whole. You need to live right. Why? Because. If we're living as a Christian, if we're living to the glory of God, we're displaying the image of God. To glory is in a sense, the way I think about it, is to His credit.
Yeah.
So if there's an attack on my personhood in a society, and there's attack on the person, on the society relationship of man and woman, it's not that it's just so much an attack on the individual, so much as it's an attack on the image of God.
Yeah. For His glory.
Yeah. And so I'm probably not going to agree with a non-Christian society in that. But it's not because of that so much as it's because of how we were approaching it to begin with. And so all I'm asking in those conversations is for us to be able to at least have another conversation to think deeper about these things. Because I don't want for that to be lost out of argument of you're just attacking me.
Yeah.
Now I don't think that it's better for society, and I don't think that it's better for the individual, but I'm coming at that from a biblical context, which they're probably not going to agree with. Yeah. And the sad thing for me is that the only way that is found out oftentimes to be true is through time and distance. Now, I think that if we looked at history, we could probably see that history has shown that societies that go in that direction generally don't end up better. Yeah. But unfortunately, sin isn't just an intellectual affair. Sin doesn't make sense. It's not reasonable.
It's destructive.
Yeah, but it's also not reasonable. It doesn't make sense. So I know and understand that if I move outside my marriage and having an affair, that it's going to destroy me, it's going to destroy my wife, it's going to destroy my kids, and it's going to hurt the church. But we still struggle with doing it. Yeah. Why is that?
You're right. That makes no sense.
It's not just an intellectual thing. It's not, sin isn't intellectually reasonable. So it's a soul thing that's going on, and I'm holding that all of that is rooted back in Genesis 1, 2, and 3.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can, that's why for me it matters so much, is because if we can really stop and think and really get that right and have discussions about it within, but also outside of the context of just scientifically, are we a billion years old or are we 1,000 years old? If we can get outside of that and think in terms of design and purpose and all those
Mm-hmm.
things, we reach a deeper level. Now, I personally don't. I mean, I personally believe that there are people who struggle in terms of whether it's homosexuality or today transgender and all those things, that those are legitimate feelings that they have.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not opposed to saying that who am I to say that they don't genuinely have an attraction towards these other things?
Mm-hmm.
But I am saying, just because you have an attraction towards something doesn't mean it's something that I ought to do.
Yeah. Because it's the sin within, and then it's taking any sin. Not just these sins, but any sin, like you had mentioned, adultery, anything takes away from the glory of God.
If I take it outside the sexual realm, if I have a disposition to be angry at someone else to the point of doing destructive things,
Mm-hmm.
do I have the right, or should I act on that inclination?
No.
And yeah, if as long as I'm not mad at you, you might say okay. But if I'm upset at you, you'd say no.
Yeah.
But no, we would say no. We need to have a certain amount of self-discipline and restraint in not just moving based upon our inclinations.
Mm-hmm. All these feelings.
Yeah, all of these feelings and everything else. Now, I can understand though then why it's moved over towards, and I think that's where we're going to come into a huge divide, is because I can understand where they're coming and saying, well, you're not just attacking what I do, you're attacking who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because we're talking about this inside desire, inclination,
Mm-hmm.
all of those kinds of things. So if we're not coming from the same point in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, we're not going to end up at the same place on how to deal with those things.
Yeah. Let me ask you, as a pastor of a church, when culture is sometimes so loud that it feels overbearing, and we're Christians and you're leading a church, how do we have healthy conversations and still stand on this is what the Bible says, this is where I'm going? We've seen some churches kind of give way and say, well, we're going to marry same-sex couples now. We're going to do. So can you kind of talk to the listener who's like, I agree with you. I agree with what y'all are saying, but how do I live this out with my friend who doesn't agree, or my family member who doesn't agree?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that the church really has to wrestle with is how do we love others well? I have a problem with transgender and homosexuality and living together, used to be living together. And I have a problem with that until it comes into my world. When it's my son or my daughter, now all of a sudden, I have to think through that differently. Well, why is that? That's a love thing. Before, when it was an academic exercise, I don't have a problem telling you. The sin that I have a problem with is always other people's sin. It's not my own. Right?
Yeah, that's so true.
So I think one of the things that we've got to do is we have to really think through how do we love others well. And my definition of love is having the highest is having the highest good of the other in mind. Because love sometimes is going to say no, and that other person is going to be upset, and in being upset because I said no, they're going to call it an unloving act. And so I have to rise in love. I rise above a lot of different things because I'm seeking the highest good in the one loved. Now, if I don't if I don't have a strong basis for believing that a person entering into a same-sex relationship that's in my world is going to hurt them in the long run, is not better for them in the long run, I'm not going to tell them that I disagree with it. I'm not going to tell them that, you know, what I feel like they're doing is wrong, you know, and different things like that. But I'm going to do it in such a way that that hopefully it's received. So there's as far as I can tell, there's three types of individuals in Proverbs that we deal with. There's the wise, there is the foolish, and then there's evil. And the best that I can see is that with the wise, you're able to sit down, have a conversation, and through that conversation, it's received, and at least an attempt to implement to some level. To a foolish person, they won't receive it, and they most of the time don't even want to hear it. So for us to have that conversation with a person who doesn't want to hear it, is then we become the foolish one. So the way I see Proverbs talking about the foolish is that with the foolish, you tell them what the problem is, that you're not willing to even listen to what I'm trying to say, and then you speak to them the consequence if they continue going whichever path they're going, and that's about the best you can do. And the response of the foolish will be that some see that, heed the warning, and turn. Most have to experience the consequence, and then they turn. Some live through the consequence and do it again, and live through the consequence and do it again. And the third person, being evil, you call the law and run. I mean, really and truly, you don't try to interact with someone who's doing you physical harm, doing you. I mean, it's evil. You don't try, and you call the law and you run. Now, I think that's a relation to the individual. So if I've got a friend who's going into a different path that I would choose for them, I'm going to try and sift through what level of conversation can I have with them. I'm always going to try and seek the highest good in the one loved, and I'm going to try and meet them where they're at with an empathy that says, I may not understand what you're going through in terms of whatever inclinations or the place that you're in, but I've got to remember that I've been in that place in some other area. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't stand where I'm at, because I'm going to stand where I'm at. I always like to say, you know, if the prodigal went with the son would have no place to return home to.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah.
You know, he gave the son his inheritance, which, you know, what's that? I don't want to see you spend this, but he gave it to him for him to go and do, but he stayed at home in that regard. Now, I think in terms of the church, and I don't know if this is a question you're asking too, but I think in the church, I think that the church has to get back towards thinking through membership and thinking through community. I'm not going to help someone else well whom I feel threatened by. Okay. And so if the church feels threatened in particular areas, then they're not going to be able to minister well to those people who are in those areas. And a lot of times that happens with this particular thing, with the gender things that are going on, marriage things that are going on, and that kind of a thing. So so for our church example, I like to say, you know, there's different levels of connectiveness and commitment. So you can come to our services and sit down, and we want you to be under the word and this what we teach and those kinds of things. Because of the way we operate in terms of governance, that individual would not have an effect, if you will, in being able to change the direction of our congregation.
Yeah.
But we want them to be able to be under the word. So, you know, we've had people that have come that, you know, we knew were not married and living together and those kinds of things, but we didn't feel threatened by that, nor did we, although we didn't agree with it, we didn't feel threatened by it, and we were able to still work through that in terms of speaking the word. Well, interestingly enough, we've had people who, when we went through, I think I went through Song of Solomon once. Well, it's heavy into relationships and marriage and all these things. Well, we had some where they looked at that and they said, oh, wait, you know, I'm convicted that this has got to get corrected. And you know, instead of just living together got married. We've had others who were underneath that and they said, I don't want any of that, and they left.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those are total individual responses.
Mm-hmm.
But as a church, we were able to minister to them, hopefully, where they're at. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not harder as it relates to homosexuality, transgender, and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say right now that the church is going to respond well in all those things, because there's also an issue of, and it's a legitimate question, of how much of that is influencing my kids and influencing what's being seen, and what effect does that have on my family?
Mm-hmm.
My hope would be that as a church, we've helped mature our families so that our kids, we can have those conversations with our kids
Mm-hmm.
in real time, in real life. That's where I want to have that conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
Because now we're in a protected environment that's meant to be for mom and dad to discuss these things and really work through these things while they're at a young age, rather than let's avoid it until then they leave. Well, then it's their responsibility. You're right, it is their responsibility, but did we do all that we could to raise them up,
Mm-hmm.
to stay connected with it? So it's a complicated solution.
Mm-hmm. But even as we're looking at creation, we see that creation answers all of these
Right.
questions. But as Christians, it is hard sometimes to live in a world that is full of sin.
Yeah.
I love the point that you gave with the word love looks different than what society tells us it is. You know, sometimes the world says, we just want you to agree with my truth, agree
Right.
with what I'm saying. But what you're saying is sometimes love is hard.
Right.
And love is, can I please show you this sin that's going to be detrimental to your
Right.
life? That's such a great point. Because even sometimes those conversations are not fun.
Well, and we're naive at best to not think that this is not going to come into our own personal world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, we sort of stumble at the gate if we say, well, this isn't, I have a strong stance on this, and my only response to that is that's good, but that picture of that person that you have, make it your granddaughter.
Yeah.
Well, it's never gonna. No, don't never say never.
Mm-hmm.
You pray that it's not. But the only reason I say that is because I think as a church, I know, right now I'm talking to the church, in this statement, but as a church, we have to prepare ourselves as best we can, not for an us and them, but how do we love well in the society to which we've been given? And it's, what we are struggling and facing right now is not different from what other Christians in history have faced.
Yeah. And that's so encouraging.
It's just different for us.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that is different for us is we're living in a transition, my generation especially, we're living in a transition that we've never lived before, in the sense of the mainstream society have a Christian moral ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And we are one thing that's different for us is that we are transitioning out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not a society that is raised from birth in that. So we're in the midst of a transition in that. Well, then it's incumbent upon us to learn and how that we live in the midst of this transition,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can love well, represent God well, in the midst of mercy and grace and not being naive.
Yeah. And continue to go back. You've made creation so exciting during these past couple of podcasts. And I think that anyone listening should be encouraged that we have the answers we need. We can dive in. Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 answers so many life questions for us. So anything else you want to add as we wrap
We don't
up?
have time.
Yeah, I know. We could just keep going. This was so good. And I think, I know this was a question that I asked you. How does understanding the biblical perspective of creation help us? And I think we've answered that so many times during this podcast. It helps in every aspect of our life.
Sure. Yeah.
So thank you so
Absolutely.
much for coming
You bet.
on. And thank you guys again. If you are on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, leave some comments. Maybe we can get them back to answer some more questions. Thank you guys again for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Bye.